Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulihil Kareem. It's my privilege to welcome you to this fifth of 7 sessions on signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, history, science, and the soul in Islam. Last week we went over the tree of knowledge, and at the end of the session, after the session was over, I noticed that some brothers and sisters still had questions about the nature of knowledge. And those questions come about because, and I emphasize, all of you, please pay attention, this is very important. It revolves around our understanding of time. And I'll spend 2 or 3 more minutes on time. In the Quran, and I appeal to you, if nothing else, after these sessions are over, after the series are over, please take this as an action item to study the Quran. Tell your children and grandchildren and husbands and wives and uncles and everybody else to study the Quran. It does not mean you'll become scholars of the Quran, but you will be knowledgeable. The Quran presents to us multiple meanings of the Quran. The word yawm is used in multiple contexts. It could be translated to mean a day or infinity. Any measure of time could be yawm. Normally in our conversation we translate the Arabic word yawm to mean a day. It does not mean 24 hours or 12. No, it doesn't mean that. That's number one. Secondly, the Quran talks about the relative time. The angels ascend to him in a day, a measure whereof for you is 50,000 years. Relative time. The Quran talks about the passage of time. Wal asr. Asr is the passage of time. The Quran talks about timeless time, ad-dahr. Was there not a time, meaning was there not ad-dahr, when insan, humankind, was not even mentioned? And there is a hadith Qudsi that says, O son of Adam, and I'm translating, do not abuse time. I am time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to himself. Time in the sense of ad-dahr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to himself as ad-dahr. I am time, O son of Adam, do not abuse time. And so on. So what happens is this. Ilmul Ibara is time bound. I mentioned that. Anything that we study, anything that we read, anything that we experience in this world is Ilmul Ibara. Ilmul Ishara, I explained, is knowledge of the heart. That is timeless. Love is timeless. You cannot teach people to love. Either it's a blessing that comes from him, up above, or you don't love at all. Then I also explained Ilm al-Laduni, which is the privilege of the Anbiya that comes to us from the prophets. So when we ask a question about the nature of the Quran, or the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are exceeding the bounds of reason, the bounds of time. See, Al-Ghazali, even the great Al-Ghazali, I explained to you how the Mu'tazilis fell into a trap. They applied time to Quran. Doesn't apply. We do not know anything about the time domain in the domain of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't know anything. And it behooves us to say, Allah, I don't know. That is the right answer. So when we ask a question about the nature of God, which the unbelievers used to ask the Prophet, that's how Surah Al-Ikhlas was revealed, because the Jews used to taunt him, tell us something about the nature of God. So people ask questions about the nature of God and the nature of this. The difference between Christianity and Islam is manifest. You see, in Islam, Isa alayhi salam is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Christianity, Isa alayhi salam becomes the Son of God. One brings a person into the time domain and ascribes to that person divinity. Another keeps the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala where it belongs. So then to ask, well, why can't Allah become whatever is, that question is not germane. So we have to be careful when we ask questions as to what the limits of the question are. You know, we cannot ask a question that is impertinent. That's very important. Okay, secondly, I presented to you the genius of Al-Ash'ari, rahmatullah alayh. The genius of Al-Ash'ari was that he looked at time and he said time was discrete. Call it digital time. You can take digital time and divide it into whatever, right now, most of you can relate to it, whatever number of parts you can divide digital into. And he said at every moment of this atom of time, the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervenes and determines the outcome of things, and to which I will add in and all times in between. And that is what has determined predominantly the Sunnah thought in Islam. Al-Ash'ari. Imam al-Ghazali was an Ash'ari. The great man that he was, and I'm transmitting to you some very subtle points, so please pay attention very carefully. This is not for the awam, this is not for the ordinary people. The great al-Ghazali himself fell into the trap. See, in the year 1100 when he wrote, he was a skeptic by nature. Anyway, when he wrote his Ihya al-Ulum, the world of Islam was divided between the Fatimids and the Abbasids, Shia, Sunni, the Sixer Shias and the Sunnah school. Al-Ghazali was faced with a two-pronged battle. Battle number one was against the Fatimids, against Al-Azhar, if you want to call it. Al-Azhar at the time was still, no, excuse me, I stand corrected now. By the time Ayyubids had taken over. Earlier, it was a center of Fatimid learning. So he not only took on the thinking of the Fatimids, he took on the thinking of the philosophers. And then, if you read him carefully, he also falls into the trap and he says, there is no cause and effect. It's not necessary that there be cause and effect. The two exist side by side. Now, as a philosopher, let me go back one step and pass it on to you. See, the contribution of Al-Ghazali was the following. Until the time of Al-Ghazali, people looked at tasawwuf through the angle, through the prism of philosophy. People looked at tasawwuf with the prism of philosophy. Al-Ghazali changed the sequence. He said, I'm going to look at philosophy through the prism of tasawwuf. That was the key. Now, what he says would make sense to an awliya. That's a different issue. But the impact of that in Islamic civilization was a disaster because people misunderstood him. They said there is no cause and effect. This is what happened to Muslims. If you plot empirical intellectual activity in the Islamic world, there is a definite drop after the 12th century. Of course, there are other reasons for that too. But Imam al-Ghazali, the great, great, great man that he was, on whose shoulders we stand, he too overextends his reach when he speculates on the nature of time. These are things we should know. Now, I said I was going to talk a little bit about the Crusades and about the Mongol invasions. These are broad subjects. And everybody, when they think of the Crusades, immediately they jump to Jerusalem. Oh, they came to Jerusalem, and they killed all the Muslims, they killed all the Jews. The Crusaders whatever they did, etc. But for a distinguished group like this, that is not enough. I'll give you a deeper background for the Crusades. If you want to understand the Crusades, you must go back to the 9th and the 10th century. Towards the end of the 9th century, actually it started from the 8th century, but certainly by the end of the 9th and the 10th century, 3 things happened that determined the shape of human civilization for the next 1,000 years. Number 1 was the conversion of the Turks. Number 2 was the conversion of the Germans. Number 3 was the conversion of the Russians. The 3 great people who determined the outcome of social, political, and military relationships from the year 1000 till the year 2000, and perhaps even today. How did it happen? The Turks were a nomadic people. And incidentally, there is a very good series called Resurrection, produced by a Turkish filmmaker. I would recommend that all of you watch it, about the origin of the Ottoman Empire. It's a good one. Netflix, excuse me. It's on Netflix. I would recommend you one. In any case, the Turks, by the 7th and the 8th century, they were always a restless people, nomads, but they had a very strong sense of tribal cohesion. The tribal leader, the Adat, or the rules and regulations of the tribe. They had a strong adherence to it. And since they were nomads, they had in profusion the virtues of sincerity, courage, honesty, integrity. And incidentally, if you want to understand why it was that Islam took root in Arabia initially, it was partly also because the people initially who accepted Islam were all desert dwellers, not city dwellers initially. In any case, you find these virtues in profusion with them. However, they were not clean like the city dwellers of Medina, or certainly not Damascus and Kufa. And in the 8th century, in the 9th century, they started to migrate towards southern Iraq and into the Arab lands. When they migrated, they were resented sometimes by the city dwellers. Hazrat Abu Hanifa, who lived between the year 700 and 763, approximately. One of his sayings, famous sayings, the iman of a converted Turk is equal to the iman of a person who lives in Medina, is well known. Egalitarian outlook of Imam Abu Hanifa. Gradually, these Turks accepted Islam. It happened gradually. It did not happen overnight. However, by the middle of the 9th century, the Turks were in great demand because they were warriors, seasoned warriors. And yet another thing begins to happen about this time, the middle of the 9th century. If you wish to understand global history, if you wish to understand the origin of the Crusades, you must understand global history for the young people. If you want to understand why Aurangzeb wrote whatever he wrote, you must understand global history. If you want to understand Mahmud of Ghazni, why he raided India, you must understand global history, which means you must also know geography. Do not study history without a geography book, an atlas in front of you, so that you know how things were happening. In any case, in Europe about the same time, profound changes are also, I'm talking about the 9th century now, I'm not talking about the Crusades yet. The Carolingian Empire that was in the, towards the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne, the Pope vested him with the keys of the Holy Roman Empire. It included what is today France, Germany, and northern Italy, and portions of northeastern portion of Spain. When he passed away, the people who inherited this kingdom quarreled amongst themselves, so Europe once again came apart. Remember, Europe had been invaded by the Vandals, the Germanic tribes, when the Roman Empire broke up. And the Germanic tribes were divided into two parts, the Eastern Germans and the Western Germans. The Western Germans were ruling Spain, and the Eastern Germans were ruling northern Italy, France, and Germany. So these Eastern Germans were still disbelievers. They were not into Christianity yet. Charlemagne waged war against the Germans. I'm summarizing it. In the year 804, for instance, in one of his raids on northern Germany, he killed 4,000 Germans to force them to accept Christianity. The Germans, the Visigoths, were plain folk. They were nomads, like the Turks. Gradually, through the impact, on the one hand, of the hammer of Charlemagne and the coaxing of the church, they accepted Christianity. This happened at the beginning of the 9th century, global event. Then, as more and more Turks coming back to the east accepted Islam, those around the Caspian Sea, which is today in southern Russia and northern Turkey, there was a tribe called the Bulgars, from which the current name Bulgaria comes from. The Bulgars come from the Caspian Sea area originally. They accepted Islam. When they accepted Islam, gradually they spread northwards towards Kiev, which was the historical capital of Russia before Moscow became the capital of Russia. And they invited the Russians to become Muslim. However, about the same time, delegations from Constantinople, which at that time was ruled by the Eastern Romans, and they were called the Byzantines, delegations from them also went to Kiev and convinced the rulers to accept Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This happened towards the end of the 10th century. The Russians became Eastern Orthodox, the Turks became Muslim, and the Germans became, at that time, Catholic, and that cast the shade of the old world for 1,000 years. In addition, as there was convulsion in Europe, Europe became highly disorganized politically. It was a vacuum, a political vacuum and a social vacuum. Into this social vacuum, the church injects itself. And it declares itself the intermediary between man and God, meaning the following. When we speak of the dark ages of Europe, between the 8th and the 11th century, what we mean to say is that Europe was in the age of imagination. It was the age when the Europeans believed in talisman, taviz. You know, people walking on taviz. Talisman. Going to the church for favors. When you're born, you go to the church, pay them money to get accepted. When you die, you go to the church and those rites are performed. In the process, the church becomes richer and the chieftains, local chieftains, become poorer and poorer and poorer. Gradually, the abbeys, or the church locations, became so rich that they constructed walls around their abbeys, which were stronger, bigger, more powerful than the walls around the fortresses built by the kings. This was all the Middle Ages. One other thing happened during this time. Because of the weakness of Europe, it attracted invaders both from the north and the south. From the south, it was the Muslims. The Muslims of Spain, after the beginning of the 9th century, seeing an opportunity, advanced further into southern France and all the way into Switzerland, Lake Geneva, crossed Lake Geneva, set themselves up onto the roads leading to northern Italy and started to collect taxes. That's how far they went. This is, now I'm talking about the 9th century. Sicily became Muslim, a Muslim conquest. Sardinia became Muslim. However, more importantly, Europe also faced the invasions from the north, from the Vikings, today's Scandinavian countries. These Vikings would raid all the way from Scotland to France, sometimes all the way into Italy, and into what is today Russia, northern Germany, France. They would raid, capture slaves, and bring them to the Volga River, and through the Volga River, they would transport them to the Caspian Sea, where they would sell them to the Jews and the Muslims. Amongst the Muslims, these slaves were very valued. The men were valued because they were strong, Germanic people. They were mostly Germanic people, Eastern Europe. Strong men and beautiful women. The Muslims valued them for both. But there was a difference. When these slaves entered the courts of the Muslims, the Turks mostly, because I'll come to how the Turks came to dominate the landscape. When they entered the courts, they were converted to Islam, accepted Islam, and when they accepted Islam, they rose in the ranks. The men became generals, and gradually they became kings themselves. That was the origin of the Mamluks. Mamluk meaning slave. But they were Mamluk Turks, they were called. They were really not Turks. They were Eastern Europeans, but of course there was a mixture all the way through. And these Mamluks ruled Egypt for a long time, India for a long time, and for almost 200, 300 years acted as the bulwark against incursions from the West. Origin of Mamluks. Why is all of this important? Because all a prelude to the so-called Crusades. So now, since Europe is in the age of imagination, and the ordinary people go for these talismans, tavis, that so many Muslims these days go for it too. What better talisman was there than the Holy Sepulchre, namely the cross and the body of Christ, which according to Christian beliefs is buried in Jerusalem, the Church of Holy Sepulchre. There are people here who are from Jerusalem, they will tell you about that. I had the privilege of visiting it one time, we had the privilege. That was the Holy of the Holies. And Jerusalem was controlled by the Muslims. So, for a long time, the popes, to get the Europeans together, to use their penchant for talisman, thought of using European energies to go conquer Jerusalem. They did not have the ability up until the last portion of the 10th century. Last portion of the 10th century. People date the onset of the Crusades from the year 1096. Actually, the Crusades started 100 years earlier in Spain. The Crusades were not focused upon Jerusalem. It was a civilizational attack all the way from France through Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Palestine, Turkey, and leading into the interior of Syria. It was a global attack all across. However, the Christians were not in a position yet to pose any challenge to the Muslims in West Asia, which is Palestine and Egypt. They were secure. However, in Spain, which was in an advanced stage of political disintegration, things were different. In the 11th century, the conquistadores, that is the Crusaders as they were called, advanced into Spain, 11th century, conquering one major town after another. Until in 1086, they conquered Toledo, the ancient capital of Spain, a turning point in world history. Why? Because when they conquered Toledo, all the libraries of Toledo, and remember, Spain was a center of learning in the world, center of learning. So many great libraries in Toledo, in Seville, in Córdoba. All of these were towns wherein you had great men of learning, great libraries. These libraries fell into the hands. And immediately the church set upon itself to translate these books from Arabic into Latin, starting with the year 1086. When you look at when the University of Paris was established, when Oxford University and Cambridge University and the universities in ancient universities in Italy were established, they were all established within 50 years after the conquest of Toledo. That was 1086. Now, let's go back to the eastern part. Again, I said, you must understand the interconnection between the East and the West if you want to understand the Crusades. If you don't understand the Turks, you cannot understand the Crusades. The Turks were not after the Arabs. The Turks were after Jerusalem. And the people who controlled Jerusalem at the time, again, I'm giving you too many facts, but it's important that especially the young people see the interrelation. Things were very fluid. Remember I mentioned to you that North Africa and Egypt were controlled by the Fatimids? People do not know that when in 1096, Pope Urban II, when he declared the Second Crusade to go capture Jerusalem, Jerusalem was not controlled by the Sunnah school of fiqh. It was not controlled by the Turks. It was controlled by the Fatimids of Egypt. At the time of attack on Jerusalem in 1096, the previous 2 or 3 years, there was a tug of war between the Turks and the Fatimids as to who was going to control the highlands of Jerusalem around. And beautiful area. Palestine is beautiful. It has hills, beautiful hills. The Fatimids were controlling it. So now, Pope Urban II, seeing an opportunity to fire up the zeal of Europe, declares the Second Crusade, and Europe hurls itself. That's the right word to use. Anybody and everybody who had, you don't have to have a sword. Whatever he had, a stick, a hammer, and 1 million people, march. And on the way, they slaughtered the Jews. And in this meantime, the Eastern Islamic world is divided. The primary division was between the Fatimids and the Abbasids, between the Shia and the Sunni. For a while in the 11th century, between the year 1020 and 1056, they even competed for the control of Baghdad. Baghdad was actually controlled by the Buyid Shias for a few years. But the Seljuks, the Turks, one of the Turkish tribes, managed to drive out the Buyids, and they became defenders of the Sunnah schools of fiqh, defenders of the Abbasid orthodoxy in Baghdad, so that now you have Baghdad versus Cairo, tug of war. This is the time of the Crusades. So when the Fatimids lost Baghdad, they turned in vengeance against the Sunnah establishment. And that was the origin of the assassins. People think that the assassins, the cloak and dagger that you see in the movies these days, are things of this era. No. In the 11th century, the Fatimids, with their blessings, the assassins set themselves up in northern Syria, the mountains of Lebanon, and northern Iraq, and they waged a war of vengeance against the Sunnah establishment, going after the head. In the year 1090, they assassinated Nizam al-Mulk. perhaps the greatest, not greatest, perhaps the most able administrator produced by the world of Islam since Umar bin Abdul Aziz. He was the one who established the University of Baghdad where Imam al-Ghazali taught. He was the one who came up with the syllabus that to this day is named after him, the Nizamiya syllabus. You go to madrasas in India, Pakistan, there are millions of these, literally millions of these madrasas. Each one of them claims we follow the Nizamiya syllabus. They don't, but that's where the name comes from. Assassinated him. They assassinated Muhammad Ghori. Those who are from India, Pakistan will appreciate the fact that he was the conqueror of Delhi. They assassinated him. Even Salahuddin Ayyubi escaped the dagger of the assassins by a close margin. The story relates that an assassin actually made his way into the tent of Salahuddin. But because of who Salahuddin was, change of heart, he did not kill him. That's how effective they were. In any case, the Islamic world is divided. Whereas Europe now, thanks to the declaration of the Crusades, is united, hurls itself, captures Jerusalem, sets up fiefdoms all the way through. Now comes the tug of war between the two civilizations. If you want to understand the Crusades, think of a counterclockwise transfer of power. The Christians were victorious in Spain. The Muslims ultimately, through the Turks, were victorious in the Mediterranean area, recaptured Jerusalem through Salahuddin in the year 1186, a counterclockwise movement of power. A lot of different things are happening. In the West, whenever the Berbers were united, the Muslims advanced. Whenever the Africans were united, the Muslims advanced. Because the Kingdom of Spain was a commonwealth of Spain, North Africa, and if you want to say Sub-Saharan Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. For instance, in the armies of Ibn Bashfun, 80% of the soldiers were from Sub-Saharan Africa, carrying the bows and arrows that were invented by the Turks, composite materials, long range, and armor of hippopotamus, which was in profusion in the Niger River Delta. So the Africans and the Berbers decided the fate of Europe through Spain. The Spaniards became city dwellers, gradually lost their cohesion, lost Spain. In the East, the Turks were able to contain the tide of the Christian armies. I'll spend a little time on what happens now in the eastern part of the Islamic world. The Turks were always a restless people. They were nomads. They would put up their tents, move, cohesion, move, and whoever stood in their way, they defeated them. And as they moved westwards from Central Asia, they came into the lands that were established that were held by the Eastern Romans, the so-called Byzantine. The word Byzantine was invented by the British because the British and the Westerns, the Latins, don't quite want to accept the fact that Byzantium, that's the empire based in Constantinople, was the Roman Empire. It's one of those. The British don't want to give credit to anybody, but they do. Anyway. So as they moved westwards, they came into conflict with the Eastern Romans, the Christians, who were settled in what is today northern Syria, northern Lebanon, eastern Anatolia, and this leads to conflicts one after the other. And remember, there's one famous battle that was fought in the year 1072. The Battle of come to mind. It will come to age. It will come to mind.
Tours.
No.
15.
No. I'll come to it anyway. 1072. Famous battle between the Turks and the Eastern Romans. The Turks were victorious, and that determined the fate of not just Mansakert. Thank you.
Battle of Volpajana?
No, Battle of Mansakert. Very important. Please remember that. Just as the Battle of Tours determined the fate of Europe, the Battle of Mansakert determined the fate of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, and to a certain extent of Lebanon also, Mansakert. They were victorious. So you see, you got to put this really fun when you really plot these things out like a scientist does. 1072, the Turks are victorious here. The Roman Empire was freed by the triumphant Turks, goes back to Constantinople, writes to the Pope, help, help, and the Pope says, wow, this is an opportunity to get all the Christians together. 20 years later, he declares a war against the Muslims, and the Crusaders advance through Spain, and then they come to Jerusalem also, the Turks. However, in the long run, through the consolidation of power amongst the Turkish tribes, the Turks managed to expel the Crusaders out of Jerusalem and out of Palestine and reestablish Muslim power in Jerusalem and in Eastern Mediterranean. Salahuddin Ayyubi, see, the Mamluks of Egypt, as I explained to you, the Mamluks were Bahri Turks. They were Turkish people. I explained to you the origin of these Turks. They lived in the islands of the Nile Delta. That's why they were called Bahri Mamluks. They and Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, who was a Kurd, managed to expel the Crusaders out of Jerusalem. Now, to summarize these galactic things, what are the things I want you to remember? I want you to remember that the Crusades didn't happen all of a sudden. One day Europe woke up and said, let's go after. No. It happened because of historical reasons. The conversion of the Turks, the conversion of the Germans, the conversion of the Russians. Three most important groups in world history, even to this day, up until the Second World War. These were the three groups that determined the fate of the old world. That's number one. Secondly, the disintegration of Europe for 300 years and its descent into social, political, and religious dark ages, wherein the imagination takes over, no reason, and the church sets itself up between man and God, in the process becomes rich. Then towards the end of the 11th century, seeing an opportunity and the rise of the assassins and the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk, they declare a crusade against the Muslims and consolidating the zeal of ordinary peasants hurled itself, that's the right word to use. Literally, they would go surround these Seljuk armies who were used to rapid enveloping movements, surround them. They didn't have any space because there were millions of them all that were around, and they would be victorious. Using that zeal, they capture Jerusalem for a while, until such time as the Islamic world becomes just strong enough to overcome this invasion and expels them. It's a very, very brief history. You can read about the history of the Crusades in Egypt. You can read about the history of the Crusades in Palestine. You can read about the heroics of King Richard III, and certainly the heroics of Salahuddin Ayyubi. These are all great stories. But I want you to go back with a global view of history. It does not happen linearly in one place. These things are related. That's the message for today. I think I'll stop here, because if I start on the Mongols, it'll be another half hour. So I'll take questions and see if we can elaborate some of the ideas.